Hi, everyone. This is Catherine Small from the HEALEY and AMG Center for ALS at Massachusetts General Hospital. Tuning in here from Boston, Massachusetts, I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Suma Babu, who also works at the HEALEY Center with me. We have a very special guest this week, but I'll leave it to our guest to introduce himself. As part of our ongoing community Q&A webinar series, we're dedicating the second Thursday of each month to expanded access and an update about expanded access protocols. This week, or this month, will specifically be shining the spotlight on Prilenia Therapeutics and their work for the investigational product Pridopidine, which, as many of you know, was studied in Regimen D of the HEALEY ALS Platform Trial, but it's moved along the pipeline since then. And I'll hand it over, now that we've got our attendees in from the waiting room, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Babu.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks everyone for joining. We're really excited that Dr. Michael Hayden from Prilenia, the CEO of Prilenia, is joining us today for today's webinar. And Dr. Hayden, if you'd like to take the stage from here.
Well, thank you, Dr. Babu, and thank you, Catherine. And what a pleasure and privilege it is to be able to give you all an update on Pridopidine for ALS. And could we go to the first slide, please? So I've been involved in the ALS field for some time, cloned some of the genes like alsin for ALS, but really committed to finding ways that we can translate fundamental findings in science and from the lab into products and services for patients. Next slide. So I want to tell you today a little bit about Pridopidine. I'm going to give you a brief introduction. I'm going to tell you how we got to the expanded access. And then there'll be a discussion, I think, from Dr. Babu on the expanded access and where we are. So thank you for joining, and let's go. So Pridopidine is an investigational drug. It's in clinical development for Huntington's disease and ALS. It's actually been submitted for marketing authorization for Huntington's disease in Europe. It's given twice a day, and its activity is against the sigma-1 receptor. This is a receptor that's present throughout the brain and particularly also important for motor neuron function. In many clinical trials now, we've seen that the side effect profile is actually placebo-like. And we have shown now in the HEALEY Regimen D that particularly in the group that we're going to be studying in phase 3 for ALS, that this may potentially slow the rate of decline and also have slowing in speech and respiratory function and bulbar function. Let me show you a little bit more. Next slide. So in ALS, what you see is this is a whole pathway of disturbances in different parts of the cell, but in particular, there's disturbance in mitochondria and contact between the mitochondria, which is the respiration cell center for the cell, with the endoplasmic reticulum that serves it. And what this does when Pridopidine acts on sigma-1, it improves all these activities. It improves motor neuron function by decreasing stress in neurons and enhances the removal of toxic products, improves the overall connectivity, and this is also important for motor neuron function. Next slide. So we also learned that this may be an important target for ALS because people who have DNA variants or mutations in sigma-1, which are rare, but they end up getting ALS. So if you have just a single spelling error in this gene, and that, for example, if it's complete loss of function where you have absence of the gene, you get ALS that starts in childhood. And if you have a mutation that leads to just partial loss of function, you get adult ALS. So this was the exquisite genetic validation for this target. The big question became, what happens when you upregulate this gene? Can you then slow down progression and provide some benefit to people with ALS? Next slide. So when we looked at this, firstly, as we just said to you, The safety profile is it's really remarkable. It's comparable to placebo. Next slide. When we looked at the total population, everybody, and you will recall the platform study included people with disease up to 3 years, we did not see benefit with pridopidine compared to placebo in the full study population. However, when we looked at a predefined group of patients, and these were predefined as part of the study who had a more rapid progressive disease, we saw important beneficial function and effects on function, speech, respiratory function, and quality of life. All very, very important. Next slide. So here you can see, for example, the key measure, and this will be our key measure in phase 3, the ALS-FRS-R. And here you can see even at 8 weeks, even with small numbers, we see a significant slowing in decline, and this is maintained all the way out to week 24. Next slide. Furthermore, when we look, and this is what's called a forest plot, and if you look at the line that's essentially vertical, what you can see is that's the line at 0, and the purple dots are all on the right. And that means they're in favor of pridopidine over placebo. So this looks at respiratory, bulbar, and motor function. And what you can see, they're all combined to become part of the ALS-FRS-R. And when you look at each of these domains, all of them are to the right at every time point, 8 weeks, 16 weeks, and 24 weeks. That suggests that pridopidine is having impact particularly on respiratory and bulbar function, but also on fine and motor and gross motor coordination and strength. And this was encouraging because you now saw all domains of ALS being improved by pridopidine at each time point. Next slide. And here, for example, is just one example of speech. And here you can see this is the change from baseline. In the purple line, you see the pridopidine treated group. In the blue line, you see placebo. And you can see at 24 weeks, there's quite a big difference between these two. Pridopidine has maintained good articulation rate, and also speaking rate on the right is also significantly different from placebo. So this really slowed the decline in 24 weeks in this particular population for articulation and speaking, all of which are so important in terms of enhancing communication. Next slide. So in the full study group, just to summarize, there was no benefit, but in this defined group, and of course, in the full study group, you really need potentially to have a longer study to see benefit, and we may learn additional through the expanded access. But in this predefined group, in patients who had definite and probable ALS and less than 18 months since onset, as we define that as a rapidly progressive disease, there were important beneficial effects on function, speech, respiratory function, and quality of life. And also in this particular group, even though they were small, there were encouraging trends in terms of survival in this particular group of patients. There were no safety signals identified, and these observations have now helped us in planning our phase 3 study, which we have submitted now in Europe to the regulators, soon will be submitted in the US, and we plan to start this study by mid-year in 2025, and this will be conducted in Europe and the US, and will be a 48-week study in an effort to be able to follow patients for longer to see some of these benefits in this particular group of patients. Next slide. Now, you will recall that the Act for ALS was put out from the NIH, and Dr. Saikovitz and Dr. Paganoni invited us to participate with them, as some of these interesting findings and important findings seemed to confer benefit. And so we worked in an effort to essentially submit the grant and to allow expanded access to pridopidine throughout the United States now. That this will be given to patients who are not eligible for our trial. In other words, patients who are essentially more than 24 months duration, and they'll be treated now. 200 patients are being treated and recruited in the United States for this expanded access trial. The first participant was enrolled at the end of March. And next slide, and just to give you an update of where we are, we now are going to be going to 45 sites across the US and Puerto Rico, and Dr. Babu will give us an update on the expanded access program.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayden. As Dr. Hayden mentioned, this is a very exciting opportunity for expanding Pridopidine expanded access protocol across multiple sites, including sites that have not been a part of clinical trials before. This is the first opportunity to be a part of a big initiative. And for a non-seasoned clinical trial site, this is a great opportunity to sort of set foot in the clinical research space and offer the study for their community patients, including sites like Puerto Rico. It's really wonderful to get this opportunity. When we look back and see how far have we come with EAPs? More than 5 years ago, EAP was not even a concept that was known to a lot of people. We started very small at the HEALEY Center for ALS at MGH with one participant and single patient IND expanded access protocol. That then grew to a single center expanded access protocol at the HEALEY Center. And very soon we launched multi-center EAPs at 3 sites. And the Pridopidine EAP was launched in 2021. And then the Pridopidine EAP2 is the one that was funded by NIH under the Act for ALS and expanded to like 45 sites. We can go to the next slide. So as you heard before, 45 sites, 200 participants. The important aspect here is that these individuals should be mutually exclusive from clinical trial cohorts in general. So they're generally individuals who do not qualify for clinical trials. But because expanded access protocols are considered as extension of clinical care, and we've tried to bring in a lot of flexibility in the trial design itself and have staggered visits, remote visits. So it's really important that we have good safety oversight throughout the study participation. And for that reason, all these participants are required to also be established for their care at a specialized ALS center, so that there is this integration of care and research at all times to make sure that everybody in the study are safe. And we are conducting the study with the same rigor as a clinical trial. And the dosage that's being used in the expanded access protocol is actually 45 milligrams twice daily, which is the same dose as in the platform trial Regimen D. If any of you are interested in learning more about this EAP, there's a QR code. Feel free to take a picture of the QR code. And there's also clinicaltrials.gov number as well on the slide. You can go to the next slide. And these are this is an update on site activation. I see there's a question about a site in Texas, and there are many sites that are already activated. There are some sites that are almost very close to activation, and they're waiting for maybe 1 or 2 components of startup activities to be completed. And almost all sites are somewhere in the process of startup, as you can see here. So as of October 9th, there were 25 sites that are already activated, and 1 is nearing activation. And enrollment is going really, really well. And as you may remember, the first participant was enrolled in March of this year. And between March and now, we have enrolled about 87 participants in the study. And 5 additional participants are in the screening phase. And as more sites come on, this number is going to pick up very quickly as well. And you're starting to see an uptick in participation across all sites, which is very exciting. We can go to the next slide. And this is a timeline of where things stand. So the first participant, as you can see here, was enrolled within 6 months from the date of award announcement. And this is important, and I'd like to highlight this. And there's another slide we'll talk about in just a little bit as well. Oftentimes we wonder, what goes into starting up a new expanded access protocol, and how fast can it be? How fast can a participant enter the study and get the first dose? And because expanded access protocols are research studies and they have to be conducted with the same rigor as a clinical trial, there's the same regulatory requirement in terms of safety oversight, reporting, all of these things. And there are multiple sites. And as we mentioned, there are sites that are new, sites that are seasoned. We want to get everybody trained, everybody on board, and this takes time. Typically, trials take about a year or longer for the startup period, including getting all the sites activated, the protocols approved, and all the startup activities, having the electronic database ready to go for the study. And because we know that these EAP programs mean a lot for our ALS community, and we want to work under extremely aggressive timelines to make sure that participants get access to the study medication. And so our team at the Healey Center for ALS, our teams worked extremely hard to get the study off the ground, and our first participant was enrolled within 6 months. Our first site was activated also within 6 months. And since the first participant's first visit, 45 participants were enrolled within 6 months. It's about a quarter of the entire allocated sample size for this study. And as I mentioned before, recruitment is going really well. Every participant gets 2 years of treatment of Pridopidine. And if you project out the timelines, we're looking at 2027, Q1 of 2027 for the last participant to complete their last visit. And then after that, we will be working on closeout and reporting of the data analyses and reporting of the results. And so that's our projected timeline right now. You can go to the next slide. There's a question in the chat about, will you consider patients from the UK for expanded access protocol? The short answer is yes, but there are some nuances to this. So there are some regulatory and documentation work that we need to go through in terms of recruiting international patients. And I think the requirement also is because the study requires that all participants in this study are also established for care at an eligible ALS site. It becomes really important for international patients. If you're considering participation in the study, you also must be patients at the ALS Center. And there are the enrollment is really on a rolling basis at all the different sites, and as I mentioned before, all participants are required to meet all the eligibility criteria, and most importantly, participants must not qualify for traditional clinical trials. And if you're an international patient, it applies to clinical trials that are probably active even in your home country as well. So these are important things to keep in mind. The spirit of EAPs is really to offer access to experimental therapeutics for participants who otherwise don't have an opportunity to be a part of clinical trial in general. So in terms of the study updates, the Pridopidine EAP2, you can see in the second column, and how does it fare to other multi-site trials in general? This is a comparison. So the total study startup time from funding to first participant first visit was about 6 months for us. And other multi-center trials that are non-cancer trials, and this is from an academic medical center that was published in 2021, is roughly around 7 months. And what goes into that startup time is listed on the right. So there are a number of things that go into that in terms of contracts, IRB approvals, institutional paperwork, and training all study staff. And as I mentioned before, this is an opportunity to increase workforce and bring new sites. Many sites are not familiar with EAPs, and many of their administrative teams or contractual teams do not understand the differences between traditional clinical trials and EAPs. So there's a lot of hand-holding, a lot of awareness that our teams are creating across all these different sites to get the activation startup processes move as fast as possible. And thank you, Catherine. Catherine typed in the chat that the ALS TDI Trial Navigator tool is a great resource for opportunities around the world. So definitely consider that. And then from funding to IRB submission, it's taken us about 1 month, which is, and same as IRB submission to approval. And these are really very aggressive timelines. Just to compare it to other trials, it typically takes about 2 to 3 months for these activities to be completed. We can go to the next slide. I think that's basically the presentation part, and now we open it up for questions or comments, and please continue to type your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to address some of these now. So,
I just want to comment, Dr. Babu.
yeah.
It's quite remarkable. I mean, the efficiency and speed, and also the prospects for the drug that have been recognized by the community are very encouraging. And of course, the beauty here is that everybody's getting drug. There's no placebo. So we will be able to learn from this study whether this also has impact following patients for a longer period in a group of patients who have a longer duration ALS. And what's remarkable to me is that you had 45 patients by August the 30th, but then in the next 5 weeks, you had another 43 patients. So this means that the recruitment is going extremely well. And if this continues at this rate, total recruitment will be done by the end of the year or shortly thereafter, with new sites coming on. So congratulations to HEALEY again for this efficient management and recruitment and bringing these sites on board, I must say. And I'm so grateful to this community that is willing to work with us to understand whether this drug has impact in all patients with ALS, which would be so important for a safe, orally taken drug.
Thank you, Dr. Hayden. That perfectly segues into one of the questions our audience is asking. Thank you so much for Prilenia's support of EAP. Has or does Prilenia intend to use EAP data as part of regulatory approval processes?
Yes, well, the big question is we are doing the trial, and the trial will be over, as we look at the timelines, by early 2027. So at the same time, we'll be learning more about the expanded access. And I think we'll be able to learn by detailed understanding of the expanded access, whether the drug is also useful for patients who have more prolonged, more longer duration ALS. So this data will be important to understand and will contribute to the regulatory filings as to the generalizability of this drug in ALS to all patients with ALS, not just those who are definite, probable, and less than 18 months duration.
Great, thank you. There's one more question. Does Pridopidine pass the blood-brain barrier?
Yes, Pridopidine is very soluble. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, so its impact on all aspects of the brain. What's interesting is the sigma-1 receptor, its target is highly expressed in motor neurons. And so it gets particularly in those targets, it interrogates its target in motor neurons profoundly. And all the in vitro and in vivo study in animals also showed essentially the same thing, which was improvement in some of the symptomatology in animal models for ALS, as well as some of the electrophysiology and others. So yes, it crosses the blood-brain barrier actually very quickly.
And I can take the next question. Is this EAP focused on rapidly progressing patients who benefited from earlier trials? Why or why not? We are not defining participants who are eligible for EAP based off of the rate of progression. Because an expanded access protocol is, again, primarily there are two components to an EAP. One is the access to an experimental medication for people who don't qualify for trials. That's the expanded access component or the compassionate use component. And then the other aspect is, can you conduct research using EAP? And so in this case, we want to make sure that whoever's enrolling in the EAP do not qualify for other clinical trials. So there could be a rapidly progressing patient who may qualify for a clinical trial, traditional clinical trial, or they may not qualify for a clinical trial because of various different reasons, either because of vital capacity is below the cutoff for most trials, and maybe the level of disability is that they've accrued is higher. So we're not defining this as slow or fast. It's only based off of their eligibility for other trials. There's a question, maybe this is this for Catherine, patient at the Healey Center, how do I get enrolled in clinical trials?
Yep, that's a great question. I was scrounging around to put a link in the chat box. So I'm going to put a link in our chat box for people who are patients at the Healey Center at Mass General, or if you live nearby and want to become a patient at Mass General, I'm going to put a link to the website where you can view ongoing clinical trials at the center. There's also a coordination service and a research access nurse here who, little old me, just knows about the platform trial, but our research access nurse, Judy Carey, can talk through all the different trial options at the Healey Center here in Boston, Massachusetts. So I'll put that info in the chat box momentarily.
Thank you, Catherine. There are a few questions all related to eligibility of for this particular EAP. And so we can also type the link to the ct.gov that has all the inclusion-exclusion criteria for this EAP as well. And this question is for you, Dr. Hayden. Were other markers of progression, such as muscle weakness in limbs, also affected?
Yes, so we saw, as you can see in what we showed you, is the forest plot, which showed the purple dot. What you saw is that even for motor function, we saw improvement relative to placebo. So there was overall, but the major impact was on respiratory and bulbar function. And that's also because the sigma-1 receptor is the most highly expressed in that part of the brain that controls respiration, speech, and bulbar function. There have been other drugs also that have been used that are not as potent or as selective on sigma-1, and that's Nudexta, which has also been shown in short-term studies, 30 days or very short-term, to improve bulbar function and also some speech. So and it was thought by Dr. Smith that this was again due to activation of sigma-1. So there's other additional information that would support activation of sigma-1 as providing benefit. And certainly here, of course, it's a drug that's very safe. We have treated also patients with Huntington disease because it acts in general on aspects of neurodegeneration and upregulating function that's depressed in many aspects of neurodegeneration, including Huntington disease. This has also yielded some benefit that resulted now in a marketing authorization application in Europe for Huntington disease that has just been submitted.
That's great. And there's another related question about pridopidine and dextromethorphan. Both are activating sigma-1 receptor. How are they different?
They are actually quite different. So dextromethorphan or Nudexta in that form is not as potent on the sigma-1 and also has activity on other receptors in the brain. Whereas pridopidine at this dose, 45 milligrams BID, is highly selective and highly potent on this. So it happens to be the most potent selective sigma-1 receptor upregulator or agonist that's known. And so it's a little different to Nudexta in that is less potent and also acts on numerous other receptors.
Thank you. And then there's one question about any impact on the liver.
No evidence for any liver effects at all. No hepatotoxicity, no increase in liver enzymes. Liver function is maintained and normal throughout the duration in this study for patients now have been followed for up to 7 years with some other diseases. Yes.
Great. And then another related question is any effect on creatinine levels or kidney function?
No effects also on kidney function because this drug is excreted by the kidney. we wouldn't want to use this in patients who have complete renal failure because they can get much higher levels. And again, at much higher levels, we don't know a lot about the toxicity, but we'd worry about it. So in general, patients who have significant impairment in renal function would be contraindicated, but this is the way the drug is excreted and got rid of out of the body. And so patients with very severe renal function would not be eligible for this drug at this point.
And another related question to that, and I can take this one, somebody who participated in the Regimen D and saw an increase in creatinine levels gradually and stopped the trial. And the question is whether it's safe for them to consider the expanded access protocol. I think I don't think it's an easy yes or no answer. I think it's best to maybe discuss with your neurologist so that they can look at your entire clinical picture as a whole and decide whether this is the right study for you to participate in. I think that brings us to the end of the webinar time, and all great questions as always. And thank you all so much for such an enthusiastic participation. And Dr. Hayden, thank you so much for joining us on this webinar.
Thank you all, and thank you for organizing it. And thank you all of you for being so attentive and present and for these very important questions. So thank you all.